dog runs away every night. A hidden camera reveals a terrifying truth. George Hamilton, 80 years of age, was a man of routine and quiet resilience. He lived in the same modest, two-story house in the suburban town of Oak Haven, Connecticut, that he'd shared with his late wife, Martha, for over 50 years. It was a comfortable house, filled with the accumulated memories of a life well lived, family photographs, hand-stitched quilts, and the faint, lingering scent of Martha's lavender potpourri. George, however, was starting to feel the weight of the years, the subtle creep of forgetfulness that occasionally clouded his otherwise sharp mind. His constant companion, his four-legged guardian, was a magnificent Rottweiler named Max. Max was a gentle giant, a dog with a powerful build, a sleek black and tan coat, and eyes that held a surprising depth of intelligence and loyalty. George had acquired Max as a puppy shortly after Martha's passing, partly for companionship, but also for a sense of security. He'd always felt safe in Oak Haven, but Martha's absence had left a void, a vulnerability that Max, with his imposing presence, helped to fill. Their days followed a predictable, comforting rhythm. Morning walks in the neighborhood, George shuffling along at a leisurely pace, Max trotting patiently by his side. Afternoons spent tending to his small vegetable garden, a patch of earth that provided him with fresh tomatoes, cucumbers, and zucchini throughout the summer. Evenings were reserved for reading, watching old movies, and sharing a quiet meal with Max, who always received a generous portion of George's dinner. Oak Haven was, on the surface, a picture-perfect suburban community. Neat rows of houses with well-manicured lawns, friendly neighbors waving from their porches, and a sense of tranquility that belied the proximity to the bustling city just an hour's drive away. But Oak Haven, like any community, had its hidden corners, its shadows. George's property bordered on a large, wooded area, a remnant of the old growth forest that had once covered the region. It was a beautiful, wild space, filled with towering trees, winding trails, and the occasional glimpse of deer, foxes, and other wildlife. But it also held a sense of mystery, a hint of the unknown. The first sign that something was amiss came on a Tuesday night in early September. George had gone to bed at his usual time, 10 p.m. sharp, after securing all the doors and windows. Max, as always, had settled down on his bed at the foot of George's own. George awoke in the middle of the night to a scratching sound, a persistent, insistent scratching that seemed to be coming from the back door. He initially dismissed it as a branch scraping against the siding, but the sound continued, growing louder, more frantic. He got out of bed, his joints protesting with a chorus of creaks and pops, and shuffled towards the back door, calling out Max. "What is it, boy?" Max wasn't there. His bed was empty. A wave of panic washed over George. Max never left his side at night. He was a creature of habit, a dog who valued his comfort and his routine. George opened the back door and stepped out onto the small patio. The night air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. He called Max's name again, his voice trembling slightly. He heard a rustling in the bushes, and then Max emerged, his fur damp with dew, his tail wagging tentatively. He looked sheepish, as if he knew he'd done something wrong. "Max, where have you been?" George scolded gently, relief flooding through him. "You scared me half to death." Max whined softly, nudging George's hand with his wet nose. George examined him, looking for any signs of injury. He found a few minor scratches on his legs, and some burrs tangled in his fur, but otherwise, he seemed unharmed. George checked the back door, finding it securely locked. He couldn't understand how Max had gotten out. He chalked it up to a senior moment. Perhaps he'd forgotten to lock the door properly. He made a mental note to be more careful in the future. But the next night, it happened again. And the night after that. Each night, Max would disappear, returning in the morning exhausted, sometimes with minor injuries, and always with that same sheepish look in his eyes. George's worry grew with each passing night. He meticulously checked all the doors and windows, ensuring they were locked and bolted. He even started sleeping with a baseball bat beside his bed, a precaution he'd never felt necessary before. He also started to notice other small things he might have dismissed as insignificant before, but which now seemed to amplify his growing sense of unease. A garden gnome that had been moved from its usual spot. A footprint in the flower bed that didn't belong to him. a strange, scraping sound outside his bedroom window one night, a sound he couldn't quite identify. He tried to rationalize these things. The gnome could have been moved by a squirrel or a raccoon. The footprint could have been made by a delivery person. The scraping sound could have been a branch, or the wind, or simply his imagination. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. Max's behavior, the nightly escapes, the subtle signs of disturbance around his property, it all pointed to something more than just a coincidence. And the growing fear, the sense of vulnerability that had taken root in his heart, was becoming harder and harder to ignore. He was starting to feel like a prisoner in his own home, a home that had once been his sanctuary, his refuge. And he knew he needed to find out what was going on before it was too late. George's first confidant was his neighbor, Sarah Miller, a kind, practical woman in her late 60s who lived across the street. Sarah had been a good friend to both George and Martha, often bringing over freshly baked cookies or offering to help with errands. "He's getting out somehow, Sarah," George explained, his voice laced with frustration as they sat on his porch, sipping lemonade. "Every night, he disappears, and I find him back in the yard in the morning, all tired and sometimes scratched up. I've checked every door, every window. I don't understand it." Sarah listened patiently, her brow furrowed with concern. "Have you considered that he might be digging his way out, George? Rottweilers are strong dogs, and they can be quite determined." George shook his head. "I've looked, Sarah. I've checked the entire perimeter of the fence. There are no holes, no signs of digging." They brainstormed other possibilities. Could another animal be luring him out? Unlikely. Max had never shown much interest in other animals, except for the occasional squirrel he'd chase up a tree. Could someone be letting him out? Perhaps a mischievous teenager playing a prank. It seemed far-fetched, but not impossible. "Maybe you should talk to the vet, George," Sarah suggested gently. "Maybe there's something medically wrong. Sometimes dogs behave strangely when they're not feeling well." It was a suggestion George had already considered and dismissed. Max seemed perfectly healthy, aside from the fatigue caused by his nightly excursions. But Sarah's concern, her gentle prodding, convinced him to give it another thought. The next day, George took Max to Dr. Thompson, the local veterinarian, a man who had cared for Max since he was a puppy. Dr. Thompson gave Max a thorough examination, running the usual tests, checking his vital signs, and palpating his body for any signs of injury or illness. "Well, George," Dr. Thompson said, after completing his examination, "Max is in remarkably good shape for a dog his age. His heart is strong, his lungs are clear, his joints are surprisingly good. I can't find anything physically wrong with him." George felt a familiar wave of frustration wash over him. "But then why is he doing this, Doctor? Why is he escaping every night?" Dr. Thompson sighed. "It's hard to say, George. It could be anxiety, it could be territorial behavior, it could be something as simple as boredom. Rottweilers are intelligent dogs, and they need a lot of mental stimulation. Maybe he's just looking for some excitement." He paused, then added, "We could try some medication, something to calm him down, but I'm hesitant to prescribe anything without a clear diagnosis. It's possible it's a behavioral issue, something that requires training rather than medication." George left the vet's office feeling more confused than ever. He was running out of options, running out of explanations. It was Sarah who, once again, offered a practical solution. "George," she said, her voice firm, "you need to see what he's doing. You need to install a hidden camera." The idea had crossed George's mind, but he dismissed it as being too extreme, too intrusive. But now, faced with Max's continued escapes and the growing sense of unease that was settling over him, he realized Sarah was right. It was the only way to know for sure what was happening. Sarah's son, Michael, a tech-savvy young man who worked as a computer programmer, came over that evening to help George set up the camera. They chose a small, wireless camera designed for outdoor use, one with night vision capabilities and motion detection. Michael positioned it strategically in the backyard, overlooking the area where Max usually reappeared each morning, and showed George how to access the footage on his computer. "It'll record everything, Mr. Hamilton," Michael assured him. "You'll be able to see exactly what Max is up to, and how he's getting out." George felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. He was eager to solve the mystery, but he was also afraid of what he might discover. He was about to uncover a secret part of Max's life, a part that had been hidden from him. The first night with the camera was uneventful. George stayed up late, watching the live feed on his computer screen. Max remained calmly on his bed inside. The backyard was quiet, peaceful, illuminated only by the faint glow of the moon. George began to think that maybe, just maybe, the problem had resolved itself. Maybe Max's nightly excursions had been a temporary aberration, a strange phase that had passed as quickly as it had begun. But on the second night, everything changed. George had fallen asleep in his armchair, exhausted from the stress and the lack of sleep. He was awakened by a notification on his computer, a chime indicating that the camera had detected motion. He rubbed his eyes, his heart pounding with anticipation, and clicked on the video file. The footage showed Max, standing by the back door, scratching and whining. He then moved towards a window, a small, rarely used window in the laundry room. He stood on his hind legs, reaching up with his paws, and, to George's astonishment, he nudged the window latch open. The window, which George had thought was securely locked, swung inward. Max squeezed through the opening, disappearing into the darkness of the night. George watched in disbelief. He'd been so focused on the doors, on the fence, that he'd completely overlooked the windows. It was such a simple explanation, so obvious in retrospect. But the video footage didn't end there. As Max disappeared from view, the camera continued to record. And then, George saw it. A flicker of movement, a shadow in the distance, near the edge of the woods. It was too dark to make out any details, but it was clearly there, a human-like figure, lurking in the shadows. The figure moved again, closer to the house, then retreated back into the darkness. George felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just about Max escaping. This was something far more sinister. Someone was watching his house. Someone was out there, in the darkness, and Max, his loyal, protective companion, was going out to meet them. The subsequent nights became a torment of anxious anticipation for George. Armed with the knowledge of Max's escape route and the faulty latch on the laundry room window, he secured it firmly, adding an extra deadbolt for good measure. He also installed motion-activated floodlights around the perimeter of his house, hoping to deter any unwelcome visitors. But the camera footage continued to haunt him. He replayed the video of the shadowy figure countless times, scrutinizing every pixel, trying to glean some detail, some clue as to their identity or intentions. The figure remained frustratingly elusive, a fleeting presence at the edge of the frame, shrouded in darkness. He shared the footage with Sarah, her reaction mirroring his own, a mixture of disbelief and growing fear. "George, this is serious," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You need to call the police. This isn't just someone passing by. This person is watching your house." George hesitated. He'd always been a private person, reluctant to involve authorities in his personal affairs. He also felt a strange sense of protectiveness towards Max, a reluctance to expose his nightly excursions, even if they were motivated by a desire to protect him. But Sarah's insistence, and the growing unease he felt, convinced him to act. He called the local police department, reporting the suspicious activity and providing them with a copy of the video footage. Officer Miller, a young, earnest officer, responded to the call. He listened patiently to George's story, examined the camera footage, and inspected the exterior of the house. "It's definitely concerning, Mr. Hamilton," Officer Miller said, his expression serious. "We'll increase patrols in the area, and we'll keep an eye out for anything suspicious. But honestly, without more evidence, there's not much we can do. The footage is too grainy to identify anyone, and there's no sign of forced entry." He advised George to continue securing his house, to keep his lights on at night, and to call 911 immediately if he saw or heard anything suspicious. George appreciated the officer's concern, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. He felt vulnerable, exposed, like a sitting duck in his own home. Meanwhile, Max's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. With his escape route blocked, he paced restlessly throughout the house, whining and scratching at the doors and windows. He barked at shadows, growled at unseen threats, his protective instincts on high alert. He seemed to sense the danger, the unseen presence that lurked outside, even if George couldn't see it. One evening, as George was watching television, trying to distract himself from his worries, Max suddenly let out a ferocious bark, a deep, guttural growl that sent shivers down George's spine. He rushed to the window, peering out into the darkness. And then he saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of his property, near the woods. It was the same figure from the camera footage, the same shadowy presence that had been haunting his nights. The figure was closer now, more distinct. George could see that it was a man, tall and slender, wearing dark clothing and a hooded sweatshirt that obscured his face. He was holding something in his hand, something that glinted faintly in the moonlight. George's heart leaped into his throat. He grabbed the phone, his hand shaking so badly that he could barely dial 911. "There's someone outside my house," he whispered urgently to the dispatcher. "He's been watching me. I have it on camera. My dog is barking. I think he's trying to break in." As he spoke, he watched in horror as the figure started to approach the house, moving with a slow, deliberate gait. Max continued to bark furiously, throwing himself against the front door, his body trembling with rage. The figure reached the porch, and then, suddenly, he stopped. He seemed to hesitate, as if sensing something, or perhaps hearing something. He turned his head, looking directly at the window where George was standing, his face still hidden in shadow. For a moment, they were locked in a silent, terrifying standoff. Then, with a sudden movement, the figure turned and fled, disappearing back into the darkness of the woods. George remained at the window, his heart pounding, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He watched the woods, straining to see any sign of movement, but the figure was gone. He heard the sirens in the distance, growing louder, closer. The police were on their way. Max, his barking subsiding to a low growl, nudged George's leg with his head, as if to reassure him. George reached down and stroked his fur, feeling a surge of gratitude for his loyal companion. Max had saved him. He was sure of it. He had scared away the intruder, protected him from whatever harm he had intended. The police arrived, lights flashing, sirens wailing. They searched the property, the woods, but found no trace of the intruder. Officer Miller reviewed the latest camera footage, which had captured a clearer, though still obscured, image of the stalker. "We'll get him, Mr. Hamilton," Officer Miller assured him. "We'll find out who this is and why he's targeting you." But the terrifying truth had been revealed. George was no longer dealing with a runaway dog. He was dealing with a very real, very human threat. And Max, his faithful companion, was his only line of defense. The nightly escapes had not been random acts of canine mischief. They had been a desperate attempt to protect his beloved owner from a danger George had been completely unaware of. The days following the near break-in were filled with a tense, uneasy quiet. The police increased patrols in Oak Haven, particularly around George's property. Officer Miller checked in regularly, offering reassurance and updates on the investigation. They were reviewing surveillance footage from nearby businesses and homes, hoping to find some clue to the stalker's identity. George, with Sarah's help, she had come to stay with him for a few days, took additional security measures. They installed stronger locks on all the doors and windows, reinforced the frames, and added motion sensor lights to every corner of the house. They even purchased a small, personal alarm for George to carry with him, in case of emergency. Despite these precautions, George couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability, the sense of being watched. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, peering out windows, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. He slept fitfully, his dreams haunted by the image of the hooded figure lurking in the darkness. Max, sensing George's anxiety, remained constantly by his side. He followed him from room to room, slept at the foot of his bed, and growled at any unfamiliar sound. His protective instincts were in overdrive, his senses heightened, his body constantly on alert. One evening, as dusk settled over Oak Haven, George was preparing dinner, trying to distract himself with the familiar routine. Max was lying at his feet, seemingly relaxed, but his ears were pricked, his eyes alert. Suddenly, Max jumped to his feet, letting out a low, guttural growl. He raced to the back door, his body tense, his hackles raised. He started barking furiously, a deep, resonant bark that echoed through the house. George's heart leaped into his throat. He knew, instinctively, that this was it. The stalker was back. He grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace, his hand trembling. He peered through the peephole of the back door, but he couldn't see anything. The motion sensor lights had activated, illuminating the backyard, but the figure was hidden in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the light. He heard a scraping sound, the sound of someone trying to force open the laundry room window, the same window Max had used to escape. The stalker was trying to get in. George's mind raced. He had to protect himself. He had to protect Max. He couldn't let this person into his house. He dialed 911, his fingers fumbling with the buttons. As he spoke to the dispatcher, his voice shaking, he heard the sound of shattering glass. The stalker had broken the window. "He's breaking in," George shouted into the phone. "He's here. Please hurry." He dropped the phone, clutching the poker tightly in his hands. He positioned himself near the doorway, ready to confront the intruder. Max, however, had other plans. With a ferocious roar, Max charged out the back doggy door, straight into the backyard. George cried and called Max to get back. George could hear the sounds of a struggle, Max's snarling barks, the thud of bodies colliding, the panicked shouts of the intruder. George hesitated for a moment, torn between his desire to protect Max and his fear of confronting the stalker himself. He knew he couldn't just stand there. He had to do something. He cautiously opened the back door, peering out into the darkness. He saw Max, locked in a struggle with the hooded figure. They were wrestling on the ground, a tangle of limbs and fur. Max was not attacking viciously. He wasn't biting or tearing. He was containing the intruder, holding him down, preventing him from escaping. He was using his size and strength to subdue the man, to keep him pinned until the police arrived. George watched in horror and amazement, his heart pounding in his chest. He saw the stalker struggling to break free, reaching for something in his pocket, something that glinted in the moonlight. "Max, get back," George shouted, his voice hoarse with fear. But Max didn't retreat. He held his ground, his grip unwavering. And then, the sirens arrived. The police cars screeched to a halt in front of George's house, their lights flashing, illuminating the scene in the backyard. The stalker, seeing the police, froze, his struggles ceasing. Officer Miller and several other officers rushed into the backyard, their guns drawn. They quickly apprehended the stalker, handcuffing him and leading him away. George rushed to Max, checking him for injuries. He found a few minor scratches and a small cut on his leg, but otherwise, he seemed unharmed. "You did it, boy," George whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You saved me. You're the best dog in the world." Max licked George's face, his tail wagging weakly. He was exhausted, but his eyes held a look of satisfaction, of a job well done. The apprehension of the stalker brought an immense wave of relief to George and to the entire Oakhaven community. The man, identified as Robert Miller, no relation to Officer Miller, was a disgruntled former employee of a local landscaping company that George had used several years prior. Miller had been fired for theft and had apparently held a grudge against George, believing he was somehow responsible for his dismissal. He had been stalking George for weeks, planning to break into his house and, as the police investigation revealed, potentially harm him. The glinting object George had seen in the moonlight was a small knife, which Miller had intended to use to threaten, or possibly even attack, George. It was Max's courageous intervention that had prevented a potentially tragic outcome. News of Max's heroism spread quickly through Oakhaven. He became a local celebrity, the Rottweiler who saved his owner from a stalker. He was featured in the local newspaper, and even received a commendation from the mayor for his bravery. George, however, was less interested in the accolades and more focused on Max's well-being. He took him back to Dr. Thompson for a thorough checkup, ensuring that his injuries were minor and treating the cut on his leg. He showered Max with affection, with praise, with his favorite treats. He knew he owed his life to this dog, this loyal, courageous companion who had stood between him and danger. The experience also prompted George to address his own vulnerabilities. With Carol's help, he enrolled in a senior self-defense class, learning basic techniques to protect himself in case of another emergency. He also agreed to participate in a cognitive assessment program, recommended by Dr. Thompson, to address his occasional forgetfulness. While he was initially resistant to the idea, he realized that his mild cognitive impairment had made him an easier target for the stalker. He was determined to take proactive steps to maintain his independence and his safety. The Oakeven community rallied around George, offering support and reassurance. Neighbors checked in on him regularly, brought him meals, and offered to walk Max with him. The sense of fear and unease that had permeated the town began to dissipate, replaced by a renewed sense of community spirit and a shared appreciation for the power of vigilance and neighborly concern. George found himself reflecting on the events of the past few weeks, on the terrifying ordeal he had endured, and on the extraordinary bond he shared with Max. He realized that Max hadn't just saved his life, he had given him a renewed sense of purpose, a reason to fight, a reason to stay strong. He also realized the importance of connection, of reaching out to others, of accepting help when it was offered. He'd always been a fiercely independent man, reluctant to burden others with his problems. But this experience had taught him the value of community, the strength that comes from knowing you're not alone. One evening, as George sat on his porch with Max by his side, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, he felt a deep sense of peace. The fear, the anxiety, the vulnerability had faded, replaced by a profound gratitude for his life, for his community, and for his faithful companion. He reached down and stroked Max's thick fur, feeling the warmth of his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "You're a good boy, Max," he murmured. "The best boy. You saved my life. You know that." Max looked up at him, his dark eyes filled with an unwavering loyalty and unspoken understanding. He licked George's hand, a gesture of affection, of reassurance, of a bond that had been tested and strengthened by adversity. George smiled. He knew that he would never forget the terrifying experience of being stalked, of facing a threat in his own home. But he also knew that he would never forget Max's courage, his unwavering loyalty, his profound love. He had faced his fears, he had survived, and he had emerged stronger, more resilient, and more grateful for the simple blessings of life. He was safe, he was loved, and he had his best friend by his side. And that, he realized, was all that truly mattered. The quiet suburban life he cherished was restored, not just to its former peace, but to a deeper, more meaningful sense of security, built on the foundation of courage, community, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog.